May Jesus be praised, and onward with Maria. Have a good and holy day to all of you, my dear children, in the sacred hearts of Jesus and Mary, and in the most chaste heart of Saint Joseph. Welcome back to our morning feature, Saints in Coffee. Today is Friday the 31st of January. The whole church is celebrating. I would say truly the whole church, because today is the feast of St. John Bosco, the father of youth. To him, obviously, we'll dedicate today's episode. As you can see, I'm traveling because I'm going from Lombardy towards Piedmont, specifically to Semigliano, where this afternoon at Casa Betania at 4 o'clock, we'll celebrate St. John Bosco. I'm bringing with me a precious relic, a fragment of St. John Bosco's blood and skin, with which we will be blessed, with which relic. Then, at the end of the Mass, we will be blessed. The service is at 4 o'clock, and we don't know how many of you will come. We hope lots. Should there be more of us than the house can hold, I've thought about organizing 2 groups. So at 4 p.m., immediately he would celebrate between Celestino and with a couple of more willing faithful. I'm waiting downstairs for him to finish, and then I'll go up. And nothing more beautiful, because the space isn't enough for us anymore, evidently. It's a good thing. I'm waiting for you, dear Piedmontese, Turinese, Cunese, all of you come this afternoon, those of you who don't. Part of the false church of Satan is celebrating St. John Bosco, where he wants to be celebrated by the right side. And then I remind you of the appointment on Sunday, the 2nd of February, and the Feast of Candlemas, the feast of the presentation of Jesus at the temple. So see you at the NH Congress in Assago, where we've been meeting recently. In Milan, obviously at 3 p.m. At 3 p.m. there will be the possibility of confessions. At 3 p.m. sharp we begin, and then afterwards there will be the welcoming of the statue of Our Lady. The Holy Mass, after first the Rosary, the consecration, the Holy Mass, and after a short moment of adoration and Eucharistic procession. They're organizing the coaches, as you know, from various places, and there's still availability to take part in this moment. Please, even though I know that many are organizing themselves with cars and their own means. Next Sunday, then, the 2nd of February, we'll see each other in Milan at 3 p.m. to celebrate the presentation of Jesus at the temple. Bring 3 candles with you, which will be blessed in the introductory rite of the Holy Mass. Then, the other big event that's being advertised is the Feast of Our Lady of Lourdes. As you can see, the 11th of February, Tuesday the 11th of February in Verona at 6 p.m. Because it's a work day, and so we're postponing the time at the DB Hotel where we met last time, at the Verona Airport Congress, via Aeroporto Caselle. Did I say Caselle, right? Right, yes. So at 6 p.m. in both cases, whether in Milan the day after tomorrow or in Verona, entry is free. There's no need to book. I'm already announcing that next week, Saturday the 8th of February, will be in Genoa, and Sunday the 9th of February in Turin. Right, then I'll give you the details next week so as not to create too much confusion. So last night there was a very important episode on the Apocalypse, and we really examined a good part of the 9th chapter of Revelation. I hope you were able to follow it, because it was really very interesting. I hope that none of those who followed it dreamt of locusts and diabolical monsters, because the episode was truly significant. I invite all of you who haven't already to watch it. You can find it available on the Ragione Domina playlist, parts 5 and 6. Friday is the day of the Passion of Jesus, my dear children. So let us adore Jesus on the cross, as Our Lady of Medjugorje, the Queen of Peace, has so often invited us to do. Now it seems she hasn't said it for a long time, but in the past Our Lady had educated the parishioners, because she had come to choose the parish of Medjugorje as a paradigm for all the parishes of the world. Our Lady invited them on Fridays to adore the cross. It's a very beautiful moment. To heal from life's wounds, first of all, because Jesus on the cross gives us his grace that saves and heals us. And then to offer our sufferings united, precisely, to those of Jesus for the salvation of the world. all the little remnant observe the two pious practices that I wanted to recommend. For years now, that is, abstaining from meat, not eating meat or its byproducts. And then also, please, the Stations of the Cross exercise. This evening then, from Savigliano, there will be the Holy Rosary with the pioneers and families. I believe it's the third or fourth meeting. A family from Piedmont had booked. Think how lovely, a family that is very dear to me with two beautiful little girls. But they're coming to Savigliano, so I said okay, that then we'll all leave from there together. I'll see you this evening at 9 o'clock. Today is a feast day, and this feast is very important to me. As many who care for me know, it's the feast of Don Bosco. Don Bosco is an indispensable saint, in my opinion, one of the pillars of holiness in post-Risorgimento Roman Catholicism, therefore modern, current, very contemporary. I'd like to go straight to today's catechesis, because I have many things to tell you. I'd like to offer an extremely concise summary, as best I can, of the message of the charism of this extraordinary and incomparable Piedmontese priest. A glory of the Italian Church, a glory of Roman Catholicism in general, and therefore also a glory of the Turin Church. The title, as you know, now appears in the description. Don Bosco, the Apostle of Youth, Joy, and Mary. This is the title I wanted to give to. Try to summarize his epic existence, I'd almost say. Don Bosco, the Apostle of Youth, Joy, and Mary. Right, we'll proceed in an orderly fashion to highlight not his life, because I can't recount his whole life, but some significant aspects of Don Bosco's existence and the message he sends us. Let's begin with the subject of the boys. They were his joy, his strength, and his love. He spent himself to the very last for them. We celebrate Don Bosco today, his heavenly birthday. It was the 31st of January, 1888. The first disciples of Don Bosco, who later became priests, had come. One, even a bishop who had come specifically, had been sent to Patagonia in Argentina and had returned. On his deathbed, Don Bosco lay dying. And his last words, before seeing Our Lady Help of Christians who takes him to heaven, we'll talk about Don Bosco's love for Mary. Were these, when they asked Don Bosco in a low voice, it seems Don Rua approached him. Don Bosco, what's your message? What would you like to say to your young people? One last word. Think about it. He was very exhausted, because even hours before collapsing to his death, they had asked him if he was still available to hear confessions. Young people sought him out for confessions, because he had such a paternal quality, you see. Don Bosco is one of those charismatic figures, like John Paul II, that people then feel the need to dust off these figures. So Don Bosco, right up to the very end, he'd been hearing confessions. Then he really couldn't do it anymore. He took to his bed. He asks for his. Don Bosco, would you share a last word with your youth? And Don Bosco, to the question whispered by the priest, replies, also whispering, these which were his last words. Tell them, I'll be waiting for them all in heaven. What a sentence, my dear children. Tell them I'm waiting for them all in heaven. Don Bosco's existence was sequestered by God and Our Lady. Are there lives of saints who put themselves forward, as is right, to become saints? But there are lives that God particularly sequesters. Don Bosco's is a sequestered existence. Right from when he was little, he was chosen by God for a mission. And you know that when he was a child, the Madonna appeared to him in a dream, like, you know, the famous missions of Don Bosco, telling him that he would have to face many trials, and now we'll see some of them. Deep down, Don Bosco was like a martyr. Think about it. His priests used to tell the youngsters, when you see Don Bosco particularly cheerful, pray for him, because that's when he's suffering the most. He tried to hide all his incredible struggles. He was a martyr. Don Bosco, without a doubt. That the devil raged against for all the good he did for hundreds of thousands of young people in his lifetime. And then his Salesian charisma around the world. He did so much good. and the Salesian charisma, which is why the devil got angry with Don Bosco and made him pay for it, as we shall see, in many ways. He was persecuted by men, he was persecuted by the Freemasons, who at that time managed the assets of the unification of Italy. And this was a priest who was talked about everywhere in Italy, especially in Rome, who was causing trouble for the project. So now, as we'll see, they made attempts on his life. And then the bishop will tell the story, I hope I have the time, how they persecuted him. They took him for a madman. They left him alone. He underwent so many trials. Don Bosco and Our Lady had told him, or rather Jesus first and foremost had told him, in Don Bosco's first dream, the one about his vocation, to transform the ferocious animals he saw into gentle lambs. And little Johnny, who was an absolutely extraordinary child. From a young age, Don Bosco truly had some unique qualities. He asked Jesus, how do I transform these wolves and these beasts into lambs, crazy man? And Jesus replies to him, Don Bosco was 9 years old, Giovanni was 9 years old. Turn to the one your mother taught you to pray to 3 times a day. Turn to the one your mother, so Mama Margarita, taught you to pray to 3 times a day. The Angelus, that is, Our Lady. And Don Bosco then sees the Madonna, who tells him that she would accompany him throughout his life, that the Madonna would accompany him throughout his life, adding in due course, all will be clear to you. Well, I'd like to share a personal anecdote. When I was a student at the Gregorian University in Rome, and I had to travel back and forth from Sicily, I'd take a plane and then the train, the Lione Express from Fiumicino. I arrived at Termini Station in Rome, and right there is the Basilica of the Sacred Heart, commissioned by Pope Leo XIII with the commitment of Don Bosco, and the Salesians are there. There's the altar where a now elderly Don Bosco celebrated for the last time, and there it's called the Altar of Tears, because when Our Lady was 9 years old, she told him, everything will be clear to you. And on that day, Don Bosco received this gift of the Virgin Mary's passing, who said to him, now everything is clear to you. And Don Bosco wasn't able to finish the Mass. My dear children, he who had always been so cheerful, joyful, happy to give himself to God, that time he started to cry. There's the plaque that tells this, the sign, and he had to stop many times, weeping, because he could see that the Blessed Virgin, his helper, as he called her, had accompanied him throughout his life, had sustained him amidst the trials. She had strengthened him in the face of difficulties, given him the strength and courage to carry on. Now it was all clear to him. So let's get back to what we were saying. The young lad finds himself having to accept a vocation, which is to dedicate himself to young people. Our Lady will give him another missionary dream, another dream, a dream. He called them dreams, but they were probably visions of his vocation. One day, still a young man, Don Bosco sees himself invited by Our Lady to step beyond a beautiful gate filled with roses, of little birds singing, fragrant flowers, a pleasant place. The Madonna invites him to enter and walk along this beautiful avenue. Don Bosco recounts having entered this splendid avenue, hearing the Madonna tell him to take off his shoes. So Don Bosco takes off his shoes and begins to walk along this extraordinary path, which is what would lead him to found the Salesian family. And he begins to feel the thorns piercing his feet. You can see that these thorns pierce him, scratch him, and wound him to blood, in his feet, in his legs, in his thighs, practically all over his body. Poor Don Bosco would like to stop because he's suffering, but he sees that the Holy Virgin is telling him to proceed, to go on, not to stop. In the face of the difficulties, the problems, the hardships that the mission entailed. And so Don Bosco continues. When he reaches the end of the road, he finds it covered in blood, because he truly, as I'll tell you now, endured many trials in his life. He died at 73 years old, worn out by his labors. How are we supposed to do it? Priests. How should we do it? May Don Bosco intercede not only for us priests of the sodality, but for all priests. We must spend ourselves, to the point of our total exhaustion, As Saint Leonard of Port Maurice said, a true priest is one who dies worn out by apostolic labors. And so Don Bosco reaches the end of the path and finds himself all scratched, marked by pain. Our Lady says to him, "You will live with pain." It will be transformed into joy. That is Don Bosco's mission. Now let's get into the specifics. From a young age, let's talk about the trials of Don Bosco. From a young age, John knew suffering, losing his dad very early on. When he was still an infant, because his dad became seriously ill and died, he was left fatherless in the family. Everything changed. Everything changed. Because his brother Antonio takes the reins, and I would say preternaturally, persecutes Giovanni, makes him suffer. Giovanni begins to suffer from a very young age. He has experienced indescribable pain. Our Lady and the Lord wanted to prepare him for his mission from a young age, because inexplicably this younger brother named Antonio persecuted his little brother Giovanni. He treated him badly. He didn't speak to him, apparently. Sometimes he even hit him, much to the grief, obviously, of their mother Margarita. So, a difficult childhood, quite poor as was common at the time. His father had died, and finally he, accompanied by the grace of God, became a priest in Turin and immediately dedicated himself to young people. As we know, he gathers these young people from the streets. We're in the era of transition from a rural society to an industrial one, with a certain delay in Italy compared to other nations, even today. This delay is noticeable compared to other nations like France, Germany, and England. That is a delay in the transition from a rural farming society to an industrial one. What do Venetian, Lombard, Trentino, Piedmontese, and then all Italian families do? Or go to the big cities like Turin. Or they emigrate and go to Latin America, most of the time, taking ships, or to the United States. And so in Turin, in 19th century Turin, there's a young Don Bosco. These youngsters arrive, they're bivouacking, they're the workforce of delinquency. The Freemasons play a lot with them because they want to use them for juvenile delinquency. We know these things have always been around. So young people camping on the roadsides, young people camping on the streets of Turin, young people who come from the countryside, around 15, 20, 30 years old. Sometimes they go there to Turin, hoping to find the streets paved with gold. But then they find themselves on the streets, abandoned by everyone, without a penny in their pockets, and therefore ready for delinquency. And so Don Bosco, as he had understood in the dream I told you about, begins to take care of them. How? With a very precise educational method. Don Bosco derives his educational method from St. Francis de Sales, the holy old John, who was the saint of gentleness. Don Bosco had understood that he had to put in love. And I say that God gave Don Bosco a special gift, a special heart. This is the gift that, in my opinion, God gave to Don Bosco. A special heart. A special heart because he had to give love to these young people. He attracted them in the most unusual way possible. He did everything to draw them to him. And his method was this. On Saturdays and Sundays, especially Sundays, he would gather these boys together and have them play mistake games. That's where the idea of the Salesian oratory comes from. He'd have them play games. He was the first to play, very young, playing ball with them or doing acrobatics. Don Bosco is a character, most of all, to be discovered. Think one day he goes to a lawyer who owes him some money. The lawyer changes his mind. Oh dear, the lawyer changes his mind. He doesn't want to give him this money. So what does Don Bosco do? He starts doing conjuring tricks with cards. And he says to the lawyer, "If I can perform tricks that you can't explain, will you give me the offer?" The lawyer was convinced that a priest couldn't perform magic tricks. So he gives him the money. This was Don Bosco. He gathers them together and performs, then gives them a snack. But here Don Bosco has to give his own. But that's 5 boys snatched from the streets. The second time, the following Sunday, because it was a truly invaluable method, it becomes 10, then 15, then 20, 25, 30, 40. His mother, Mama Margarita, who had stayed in the village where he was born in Castelnuovo Don Bosco, finds out about it. And then Don Bosco, "But my son, how can you help these people? How can you go on like this?" And he replies, "Yes, it's true, Mum. Actually, I don't know what to do anymore." His mother suggests that he should turn to the parish priests, the confreres, priests, friends. Don Bosco was one who knew how to maintain friendships well. Although now you will see that his ordeal will begin. He will remain alone. Anyway, he turns to his priest friends and asks them if, firstly, they can give him a breakfast, bread, jam, these things here. We're not thinking of anything special. Bread, jam, bread and tomato, I don't know, this sort of thing. Let's say basic food, bread and cheese, to feed the youngsters. And second, if these priests are willing to offer their parish facilities for Don Bosco. And these priests initially say yes, because that way Don Bosco can feed them and can also guarantee a space where he can receive them from time to time. The problem is that these young people grow more and more, irresistibly drawn by Don Bosco's charisma. They feel him as a father, they feel him as a friend. Above all, they see him as a man of God. They feel that in him there is the mystery of God. That's what attracts souls. Don Bosco truly was a captor of young people, a kidnapper of young people from the world. And so the trouble begins. Don Bosco's ordeal begins. I'll tell you why. Because he starts to gather these young people who are making headlines. They become news in Turin in a short space of time. Don Bosco gathers 100 young people, and then has them pray, and then has them say the rosary, and then hears their confessions saying Mass to them. And the parish priests are targeted by a journalistic propaganda campaign. Basically, the Freemasons had organized a smear campaign against Don Bosco, spreading the rumor that he was completely mad, out of his mind, that he was a priest who had been ordained, but mistakenly, because Don Bosco wasn't right in the head. And this news spread rapidly throughout the city of Turin because of Freemasonry's hidden enemies, who saw that in this way Don Bosco would defeat them because he was taking away all the delinquency and all the cheap labor. You can imagine how much this precious young workforce was abused, with minimal wages and endless working hours. And often the young people would get sick and die. So the Freemasons who had the plan, the bread, the economic power of the industrial and risorgimento revolution, Don Bosco was starting to annoy them. Because in Turin, little by little, everyone had said, if he continues like this, all the young people will go to Don Bosco. So Freemasonry has always had the same kind of dynamism. That is, it sets up a smear campaign, carried out above all by important figures from Turin, Conti, Baroni. One meter thinking of Turin, which establishes that news must be spread that Don Bosco is unwell. The problem is that the hierarchical Church of Turin gets involved in this. So the parish priests, at a certain point, decide to no longer help Don Bosco. It's a tragedy. Now, we tell the story this way, but let's try to imagine Don Bosco doing this work. Helped by the brothers, and slowly, one by one, they abandon him. Don Bosco finds himself alone, without financial support, without anything to feed these young people, and without knowing where to put them. Because they want to stay with him. So Don Bosco, weeping in secret, then joins them and tells them that perhaps the time had come for them to go their own way. These young men looked at each other and said to Don Bosco, "This will never happen. We want to stay with you. We want to embrace your charism. Father, we are faithful to you until death." And Don Bosco, two things happen that I'll tell you about. The first thing that happens is Mum arrives. It's a difficult time for Don Bosco. Everyone's abandoned him. He's alone like a dog. He no longer feels the friendly presence of his fellow priests, who, on the contrary, tell the faithful not to send their children to that madman, Don Bosco. In Turin, Don Bosco is considered mad. The newspapers launch, and it won't be the only time, a smear campaign against him. And Don Bosco, so his mother knows he's going through this, comes to Turin. There's a delightful scene. Just when his mother arrives in Turin and turns to Our Lady, together with his mother and Don Bosco, his mother says to him, "But where do you live, my son?" And Don Bosco says to him, "Come, mother, come and see the door to door." It's lovely to recount the lives of saints so concretely, as if they were right before our eyes. I pray to Our Lady that you have it like the film, but not the cinema film, often a bit of a screenplay, but the story just as it is. And so Don Bosco takes her to her mother Margherita at home. When Mama Margherita entered that small, dark, damp house, moreover unfurnished, she looked at Don Bosco. Don Bosco looks at his mother. It's the moment of extreme misery. Don Bosco is considered mad. They've left him all alone. He lives in a house that's a real dump. And so they both take each other by the arm, mother and son, and begin to sing and dance. Mum had come to tell Don Bosco, on God's behalf, go forward with joy. Don't be discouraged because you'll make it. There's another problem though, my dears. There you see that dream, a vision that Our Lady gave him of walking through sin. That walking through thorns is being realized now. The problem was something else. The problem was that yes, the joy, these young people don't leave. But Don Bosco practically leaves the house, say at 5 in the morning, and doesn't return before 8 in the evening to try to do something for these young people. He goes begging for help, for financial help, and suffers humiliation after humiliation. You know, his brothers, the priests, leave him alone. He feels abandoned, and the house is small. He sees no future. The bishop spreads the rumor that he really is mad. Don Bosco falls ill. And this is a dramatic moment in Don Bosco's life, because he gets sick and has to stay in bed. It must have been, as the biographers say. Even the early biographers, those forms of physical exhaustion, not nervous but physical. So Don Bosco enters a sort of coma. And this is also shown in the film, that the young people pray for him to recover. And the young people start a prayer crusade, the rosary in turns, his young people who deserve it too. A word of praise because they didn't leave him alone. Think, when faced with the news, some even left, but a good number stayed. When they heard that Don Bosco was mad, if they had all left, instead they stayed there and obtained and wrested from God the grace, because perhaps Don Bosco could have even died at that moment there, and he would have even been a great saint, but not complete. And they obtained the grace that Don Bosco is healed. And with Don Bosco's recovery, things began to change. Because in Valdaco, Don Bosco starts receiving offerings from the faithful. He, moreover, also busies himself to find them. And so he sets up Valdaco. He manages to create specifically a small oratory, the first oratory of Don Bosco, which is still visible in Turin today, and educates these young people. There are splendid images of Don Bosco, sitting hearing confessions and then celebrating Mass. Gives them a supernatural, surprising sermon, instilling in them the love of Christian virtues and above all purity. They were only boys. He hadn't opened the oratory for the girls. And then St. Mary Mazaretto will do it. And then the love of purity. I was saying the love of prayer, the love of humility, patience in trials, and so on. But the devil wasn't sleeping. He'd realized that Don Bosco was a huge nuisance. Because now the young people were becoming a massive number. And so the newspapers again spread the news that Don Bosco was mad. The news was so sensational that at a certain point, like enemies, when they see that their hated enemy is, despite everything, moving forward, they become even more furious. And so the smear campaign becomes so violent that there's pressure. Just imagine, have you ever heard these things about Don Bosco? Pressure on the Bishop of Turin to have him committed. Turin's asylum. And the story goes that one day 2 Monsignors arrived in a carriage to take Don Bosco to the asylum. The pretext is to visit the oratory. They arrive in a carriage with the coachman. The coachman waits. They get out of the carriage. They visit. They tell Don Bosco at the oratory, "Father, the bishop needs you." Don Bosco says, "Yes, gladly." So they arrive in front of the carriage. There were these movable steps that the coachman put down, and the door opens. The coachman opens the door, and the 2 Monsignors signal to Don Bosco to get in. Clearly it was a plot, because they would have closed the door and taken Don Bosco to the asylum. Madhouse, dear children. So let's not be surprised by what surprises us. Don Bosco seriously risked ending up in a mental hospital. Someone like 𝐥'𝐿𝐴 actually did end up in one. Got it? Don Bosco was seriously at risk of ending up in a mental hospital at the behest of the bishop. And so, finally, Don Bosco says, "Heaven forbid that I should go up before their Monsignors. Go ahead, Your Excellencies. Make yourselves comfortable. Only after you may I get in." They get in. Don Bosco closes the door and says to the coachman, "Coachman, to the asylum." The coachman set off, thinking Don Bosco was inside the carriage. Actually, it was the 2 Monsignors. This is to say what kind of insane and relentless persecution he had to face. For years, this was the label attached to Don Bosco. The newspapers, not just those of Piedmont, driven by Masonic propaganda, they tried every way to stop him. Since they couldn't succeed, they tried to discredit him, but Don Bosco carried on. And so meanwhile, Don Bosco expands his activities, the young people continue on their path, and at a certain point, a decision is made to get rid of him, to eliminate Don Bosco. Physically, he even suffered attacks. I'll tell you just 2. They're manna, 2 or 3, let's say 3, quickly to tell you the life of Don Bosco. First threatening episode, Don Bosco is asked to give the last rites to an elderly woman in a farmhouse. There's a dive bar downstairs, and above lives a woman needing her last rites. Don Bosco runs to go to this woman's house and enters the tavern where they drink wine. And so the wine is poisoned. The wine is poisoned on behalf of the Freemasons who want him dead. Don Bosco, we don't know how he knew that wine was poisoned. Or he had decided, on the advice of Mama Margarita, who gave him sound advice, not to drink or eat anything, even if it was given by loved ones. Mama Margaret recommended Don Bosco not drink or eat anything. Blessed Maria Margaret. So Don Bosco insists on not taking it. The wine, as the brigands, soldiers of the Freemasons, insists that he drink that drink there, which is apparently wine. Don Bosco says, "I won't drink it unless you drink it first." He takes the jug and pours the poisoned wine into his, let's say, assassin's glasses and tells them, "I'll never allow myself, me first." He puts them up against the wall in front of the owners. You understand? They understand, and so they play their second card. Here's the second episode. With Santo, that woman up there is dying. Don Bosco, he goes up onto on the first floor where the sick woman who needs to be confessed is supposed to be. Actually, there's no one there. The light is turned off to beat him with holy reason, Don Bosco, who, understanding immediately, evidently with the help of Our Lady, because Our Lady never abandoned him. Our Lady was his strength, his joy, his courage. Don Bosco, knowing it would end this way, gets under the table. So let's say they try to beat him with holy reason, but they don't succeed. Because Don Bosco blocks the blows with the table, moves towards the exit, but don't trust him. because he's had enough of Don Bosco and throws the table at them, running away. So these are two episodes. Another episode I'd like to share is when he's informed that there's another sick person who needs to be confessed. If it was, it's dark and foggy, it's dark and foggy. Don Bosco goes, he's led into an alley where two thugs are waiting for him. This time it's done. This time Don Bosco understood that the time had truly come, that it was over. And as the thugs are about to attack him, to throw him to the ground and finish him off, again on behalf of the Freemasons of the time, a dog called Grigio arrives. What a story, that of Don Bosco. This Grigio entered Silesian tradition as a true friend of Don Bosco. He was enormous, called Grigio by Don Bosco because of his fur, and he would leap to Don Bosco's defense when he was in danger. Like in this case here, where the dog jumps on the two thugs who are forced to run away. And it won't be the only time that Grigio saves Don Bosco from attacks. You see, how many attacks? The most sensational one, however, that few people know about, is when they decide at this point to shoot him. It's a bit like John Paul II in this. If you go to Valdocco in Turin, try in the courtyard the plaque that recalls the episode that I now tell you. Every evening, before settling down with his boys and going to his room, Don Bosco. Each night before bed, Don Bosco shared tales of saints, Jesus and Mary with his boys, then ended with an appeal to virtue. So, one late afternoon, one of those evenings there, while Don Bosco was raising his arms, because every evening then he blessed them, a hitman enters and fires a pistol shot. He fires a pistol shot, the bullet. It goes off right as Don Bosco raises his arms to bless, and it pierces. He pierced it, the cassock, passing under the armpit, passing by the side of the heart. If the shot had been fired a few moments earlier, Don Bosco would have died instantly. Even today there's the forum. Today they do it in the wall of this bullet fired to kill him. See, the Madonna had accompanied him all his life. Bosco was a man of God. Imagine St. Pius XI. His name was 𝐾𝐲𝐻𝐿. He was a priest from Milan, and he looked after the Ambrosian library. When he was young, a priest he'd heard about in Milan, and Don Bosco era il prete più famoso d'Italia, because he traveled a lot between Tuscany, Piedmont, Lombardy, especially in Rome. So this young Monsignor 𝐾𝐲𝐻𝐿, a young priest and Monsignor of Milan, goes to visit him in Turin, and he'll tell of having seen Don Bosco surrounded by people who, some wanted a blessing, some wanted to touch his hand, some wanted his rosary beads, some asked him for a healing, some asked him for a miracle, and he performed several miracles. Don Bosco. And the news had spread, in short, and there were all the people crowding around him, his young followers then. And Monsignor 𝐾𝐲𝐻𝐿 says, I saw a man of God, surrounded by people, but with his heart and mind elsewhere. So it will be Pius XI who will make him a saint. Just imagine, 𝐾𝐲𝐻𝐿, who would become Pope, and who had known him as a young man, would later make him a saint. Don Bosco's spirituality was a spirituality of the supernatural, that of joy. He wanted his young people to be joyful. It's a precious Christian educational method, that is, joy as a Christian method for facing life. Only he was quite disturbed by the devil. The devil always put a spoke in his wheel. I told you they tried to make him look crazy. I told you that his fellow priests abandoned him. That for his whole life Don Bosco struggled greatly to find the funds and the solutions to the problems that presented themselves from time to time. But he had great faith in God, and this made the devil fume even more, especially his love for Our Lady, whom we'll talk about in a moment. And that when I believe, in 1854 cholera spread through Turin, and everyone was told to stay home. And people were dying. Lobo summons his young and dying who need our help. If you can, and you see sin and you will pray the rosary, I promise you, in the name of Our Lady, help of Christians, especially if you love Our Lady, actress daughter, none of you will die. My dear children, an impressive historical fact. Don Bosco, the great Don Bosco, sent his young people from Turin to help those stricken with cholera. None of the young people from the oratory contracted cholera, and none of them died, except for one who had sinned and disappeared. So Don Bosco, just imagine, and then there's the story of Carletto. Do you all remember it? Everyone, Carletto and that young boy who dies, trying at all costs to be able to confess to Don Bosco. Don Bosco doesn't arrive in time and finds the child dead, already laid out on his deathbed. It's all the relatives and family members crying. Don Bosco really seems to be listening to the gospel, he says, but he's not dead. He's not dead. Leave me alone with him. They close the room and Don Bosco calls him, Carletto, Carletto, come back to life. Don Bosco has raised the dead. Carletto's come back to life. And he confesses to Don Bosco, and then Don Bosco says to him, Carletto, now let's call your mother. And Carletto looks at him and says to Don Bosco, if you don't mind, Father, I'd like to go back to where I came from. My dear children, the lives of the saints, if you don't like them, I'm sorry, Don Bosco, but you don't want to go to your mother. Yes, I love the Don Bosco map so much, and I love you all so much too. I would love to stay with you all too, but how beautiful what I've seen is. Let me go back. Don Bosco, give me obedience. Allow me to return from where I come, that is, from paradise. And then Don Bosco says to him, go ahead, Carletto, go ahead and remember me. Can you imagine that story? However, precisely because of this, since wherever he went, he carried the presence of God wherever he settled. Don Bosco brought love, the charism of holiness. The devil persecuted him his entire life. And here I'll open a parenthesis. It's a law from Mary, because Don Bosco never spoke of the troubles the devil caused him. The mental stations and the physical stations. Mental and physical. I couldn't tell you, which is worse. Neither of them are nice to experience. Physical temptations and mental temptations. Mental temptations, thoughts of despair, of God's abandonment, fears, timors, angoisse, preoccupations, anxieties, aroused by the devil. Don Bosco knew them. As I told you, his priests used to say to the youngsters, whenever they saw Don Bosco particularly cheerful, pray because Don Bosco is not well. Why had he decided not to show his suffering to anyone? He'd done it a little with his mother, the mother who would then die and leave him on the streets anyway. On the road of life, even if one day he will see her. An elderly Don Bosco one day is walking down the street. He enters one of these side streets of Turin, of old Turin, and he sees his mother. He tells the story himself. He sees his mom. Meeting him there, picture this, Mom had died years ago. As well as later he'll see little Domenico Santo. And when Don Bosco sees his mother starts singing God's songs. The celestial praises, and Don Bosco says, Maria, is that really you? Years have passed, and the mother replies, yes, my son, it is I. But are you in paradise, mother? Yes, my son, am I in paradise? Even though I had to go through purgatory. Father, then pray for me, my son, resist, because you will have other trials to face. And so she begins to sing. Don Bosco says that his mother, who wasn't very tuneful in life, sang God's praises so beautifully that he fainted. For the beauty and sweetness of those songs. What will paradise ever be? But Don Bosco saw paradise within. He transmitted all the love for paradise to everyone, and the devil made him pay for it with these mental torments. So some days Don Bosco was really ill. Badly, fiorigari. There are so many people today who are suffering inside, but they let themselves go. They ask for the intercession of Don Bosco today. They ask for Don Bosco's help to face their trials with joy in their hearts, singing and dancing just as he did. For physical conversations, decisive passages of his life. Did you know that some of the first youngsters then began to become priests? Perhaps I'm digressing a little, I don't know if that's the case. Anyway, I'm coming to a conclusion, because I feel like I'm only skimming the surface of the life of this great saint to whom I feel extraordinarily connected. And I was saying, Don Bosco, I don't know if you know, but most of the first youngsters, the ones I was telling you about a moment ago, gathered at first on the street, who risked coming to a bad end, became priests, some bishops, most of them missionaries in Latin America. Don Bosco started them on this path. Naturally, the devil wasn't happy. When there were decisive moments, we know from his closest collaborators that he also suffered physical attacks, which he never spoke about. Imagine this holy man arriving exhausted in the evening, especially when he was traveling. He couldn't wait to get into bed. That first sleep, that moment when, because even saints need some sleep, not much, but that little bit they need if possible. So the devil would pull their blankets, tickle their noses, turn on the light. Sometimes they even heard an incredible racket. Inside, right in Don Bosco's house, the little room where he lived, and then physical illnesses. Don Bosco was never seriously ill, but he had these minor ailments that, taken together, meant there wasn't a single day when he was truly well. He was frail from a young age, although it wasn't widely known. First and foremost, Don Bosco's biggest problem was that he suffered with his lungs. So he had respiratory problems that in winter, with a weakened immune system, with the lifestyle he led, often forced him to have fevers, coughs, asthma, and things like that. Then he had other physical problems, some of which we don't know about. Apparently it seems he also suffered from high blood pressure. And then he also had skin problems. So sometimes he had growths, perhaps even, from what I remember, hemorrhoidal in nature, which caused him great suffering throughout his life. Joyfully, always turning to Our Lady when he was old, we're nearing a conclusion, my dears, but I only stammered something. He received the first journalistic interview. Don Bosco. The first interview with a saint was done with Don Bosco, and the journalist asks him, Don Bosco, you are the most well-known priest in the world, more so than the Pope, and you are the priest. A priest who has built a spiritual empire and an empire with young people. How did you do it, Don Bosco? Don Bosco looks at him and replies like this, but I haven't done anything. Has done everything, the Holy Virgin. Let's head towards the conclusion now, old man. Don Bosco must get ready, though. Not entirely yet. Old man for the final test, let's say. And this is it. Despite the attacks from the Freemasons and the fact that for years in Turin they considered him mad, practically leaving him on his own, Don Bosco resisted and he succeeded. The problem is that at a certain point, a new bishop arrives in Turin. This bishop's name is Lorenzo Gastaldi, who was recommended to the Pope by Don Bosco himself. And with this bishop, a long and interminable conflict arises that probably slowly leads Don Bosco to die of heartbreak, a true martyr. Want me to read? His conflict with his archbishop, long, militant, tormenting, like a crown of thorns, Don Bosco had it during the years of his most splendid achievements. Bishop Francesco, the previous bishop, had ordained Don Bosco as a priest, had called the oratory the parish for boys who don't have a parish. Let's just say, basically, the bishop before Gastaldi was very fond of Don Bosco. In Turin, actually, Mr. Gastaldi was a good archbishop and had worked hard for the good of the Turin diocese. But the problem is something else. The problem is that between Don Bosco and Gastaldi, a storm breaks out with the archbishop. In my opinion, few biographers mention this. Oh, sorry, now it's a sin, today. Don Bosco makes a fundamental error and pays dearly for it. It was sent from Borgo San Martino to the Archbishop on the 14th of May, 1873. He pulled out all the stops to persuade that Gastaldi had been made Archbishop of Turin sue his request to the Pope. And Monsignor Gastaldi hadn't liked this. He thought it was a humiliation. Immediately after the appointment, Monsignor Gastaldi initially appeared friendly, but then became quite annoyed by Don Bosco's behavior. And so, a real persecution of Don Bosco begins. Canon Rosario, present at Gastaldi's speech, the first time when they ask him what he thinks, Your Excellency, of Don Bosco, we don't know exactly what he would have said, but the Monsignor leaves the meeting saying, things are going badly for Don Bosco, badly. Domina Andre writes that that was the first flash of the terrible and unexpected storm. The anti-clerical Masonic newspapers discover, it's not clear from whom, and here, if you want me to tell you, what intruders were there inside the Curia of Turin. I don't know what to say. I know that Don Bosco didn't have a moment's peace in his life, and yet he won because he remained joyful. But listen to what happens. The newspapers learn that finally the new bishop, Gastaldi, doesn't think highly of Don Bosco, and they fill the chronicles of all Italy. Why ever? Is Don Bosco known throughout Italy? And what do? They strain every nerve to make it clear that Don Bosco wants to control Gastaldi. The Milan Journal calls Don Bosco the little Pope of Piedmont. And this, of course, is made known to Gastaldi, who gets angry and furious. Even more so. Look at what La Gazzetta di Torino writes. The newspapers, on the 8th of January, 1874, the famous Don Bosco is in Rome and enjoys great access to the Vatican. You see, it always comes down to money, sex, you understand? The Gazzetta di Torino concludes, we shall see who is more powerful, Don Bosco or Monsignor Gastaldi. It was a maneuver, the last one, the heaviest. As you'll see now, it was designed to finish destroying Don Bosco. Freemasonry wanted one thing, and partly got it. If they couldn't stop him, they'd at least break him. The bishop naturally tries to keep calm, but does he feel overshadowed by Don Bosco's looming presence? So he intervenes. Someone will say that somebody will intervene in the name of God. Monsignor Gastaldi, against Don Bosco, will intervene ruthlessly. Gastaldi first of all says that Don Bosco's oratory is undisciplined, and it wasn't true. On the contrary, Don Bosco had given and was giving his young people his soul, his heart. He educated them well, but news is being spread that the oratory arouses more than a few perplexities due to Don Bosco's volcanic character. Now they play the card of Don Bosco's character. Don Bosco was a volcanic type with a strong, decisive grip. And so this is used to attack Don Bosco, saying that he wants to command the young people who, one would say today, he brainwashes them. He doesn't give them freedom. Incredible. All of this is incredible. And immediately after the arrival of the new Archbishop Gastaldi in Turin, the situation for Don Bosco becomes unbearable. Remember before? I told you a little while ago when they made him out to be mad. Only now Don Bosco is older, and this time he struggles. He becomes seriously ill. Bishop Gastaldi hears that Don Bosco is ill and asks Don Carletto, one of his closest aides, Don Bosco's collaborators, how many of you are firm and resolute in your vocation? More than 150. And if Father Don Bosco were to die? You see, unfortunately, even the somewhat sadistic way of the bishop, who, like the newspapers, also called him Papa Don Bosco, it was something that made him suffer tremendously. Don Bosco, tremendously, my dear children. He was unwell, but didn't show it. He suffered as if he were dying. Mary with the hooks, many times. This media propaganda persecution is worse than the deaths of martyrs in the Roman amphitheaters. And if Papa Don Bosco were to die, the bishop asks, reply, we will look for an uncle to succeed him. All right, but let's hope God preserves him. So, This was a little bit the atmosphere you could breathe within Don Bosco's environment. So the bishop decides to go and visit him. A dramatic time. Bishop Gastaldi goes to visit Don Bosco. One of the youths, who would later become a canon, recounted seeing the archbishop come down the stairs with hurried steps, so much so that Don Bosco could barely keep up with him, because he was ill. No, he didn't pay attention. Amidst the boys' cheers, he got into the carriage without greeting the youngsters and left. The bishop was fuming. I said to Don Bosco, the party didn't end well, was there some sort of... And he replied, "What do you want, my?" The archbishop wanted to be head of the Silesian congregation. That is, he went there to tell Don Bosco, "Give me your work." The bishop went to Don Bosco and said to him, "You founded these young people, you can't lead them." He was the devil, I'm sorry to say, but that was the devil. It was the final test for Don Bosco. Satan, enraged, wanted to tear his work from him. And do you know what the bishop said to Don Bosco? "You're not capable." Oh dear, I can only imagine the pain and martyrdom Don Bosco must have felt, hearing those words from the local authority, from the Bishop of Turin. You're not able to carry on, you're ruining them, you plagiarize them, you don't give them freedom. It's a good reality, not yours to claim. You're wrecking it. I'll take it in hand. The young man asks Don Bosco, "What did Don Bosco propose to me?" Imagine the drama. And this is beautiful because Don Bosco doesn't stay silent this time, like John with Jesus. Don Bosco opens up. That Don Bosco retraces his 6 steps, is happy to make the Silesians a diocesan congregation, handing it over to the bishop. He'll write to Cardinal Bazzari, "Don Bosco has a special talent for raising young seculars, but he has no talent for educating them." Good. Right at this point. They begin despite the work having been, I forgot to mention, recognized by the Pope, the punitive measures. On the 16th of December, 1876, Don Bosco had to explain in a letter to Cardinal Ferrieri of Rome, one of the Pope's collaborators, the main points of friction. It'll take a bit of time, but I think you'll want to know how this story turns out. The decisions made at the behest of the Bishop of Turin by Rome, against the one the newspapers luridly called Don Bosco, were about to achieve true victory. First, Don Bosco could no longer confess. Secondly, Don Bosco must leave Turin to ensure he doesn't secretly hear the confessions of his boys. Third, Don Bosco will no longer be able to set foot in the houses. Silesians he founded. Fourth, a preaching retreat for some of his closest priestly collaborators. Fifth, Don Bosco's refusal to participate in the oratory's most solemn celebrations. Sixth, I forbid Don Bosco from administering confirmation to the boys of the oratory and prohibit other bishops from doing so on behalf of Pope Don Bosco. The Pope was dethroned, Santa was getting her revenge. On the 25th of March, 1878, Don Bosco announced a new list of punitive measures. Firstly, he was threatened with immediate suspension from confessions. Secondly, the Silesian priests, some have been suspended for 8 months. Thirdly, young men who may be ready for priestly ordination are being blocked. And this is what made Don Bosco suffer the most, to the point of making him cry, was the fact that the Pope, Pius IX, who had thought highly of him, whom he'd found a friend in, with open doors always in Rome. This time, as a great friend and great protector, he cools off towards him. Don Seria writes that constantly portraying Don Bosco as a stubborn and almost rebellious man also influenced the Pope's mind. Pius IX dies on the 7th of February, 1878, while the storm rages. Pope Leo XIII, who doesn't know Don Bosco, becomes Pope. And he wants him in audience for the first time on the 16th of March. So immediately afterwards, you see that the dossier on the so-called Pope Don Bosco, whom all his enemies wanted to get rid of, was urgent. So much so that the Pope is made Pope in February, and Leo XIII receives him in March. March 16th. The report that Don Bosco writes immediately afterwards is triumphant. The Pope wants to become a Salesian cooperator. He sends warm blessings to the missionaries. Only on one point is the report brief. On our disputes with the Archbishop of Turin, the Holy Father has said, says Don Bosco, that he awaits an official report from the Congress of Religious of Vatican Cassel. So Don Bosco starts to understand that something isn't right. And he speaks of unheard of sufferings, prevented audiences, letters intercepted and made to disappear, secret letters of calumny against Don Bosco and open opposition from many sides, harsh and mortifying words. At this point, Leo XIII decides to test Don Bosco's sanctity. Listen, a difficult trial, in which just as it seems that Jesus on Calvary was stripped naked, Don Bosco also suffers this. In Rome, they're trying to build a sanctuary to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Despite the Pope's personal commitment, funds are lacking. The Pope has summoned Don Bosco and entrusted him with the task of finding, by going to France and Spain, all the money needed for the work to be completed. Don Bosco accepts, even though he can barely stand, and goes around collecting the funds. The Basilica of the Sacred Heart is completed. It was meant to be the sign that Leo XIII had somehow put forward to test holiness. It wasn't enough, because the Archbishop of Turin wants to suspend and excommunicate Don Bosco. The Archbishop's niece, Lorenzo Mazzaretto della Roche, when Don Bosco was beatified, testified under oath. Beginning in the year 1873, there were painful disputes between Don Bosco and Monsignor Gastaldi, my venerated uncle. I learned of these disagreements from public rumor and from the confidences that Don Bosco made to me and my mother, to urge us to find a way to inform the Archbishop of the rumors that were spreading, especially among the clergy. These disputes were a constant thorn in the side of both my mother and myself. In all the discussions held with my mother and me on this matter, one could see how intensely Don Bosco suffered. Of all these trials, I recorded these words of Don Bosco in my diary. Listen, these are Don Bosco's words. One has, rather, all the will that I remain strong, that I take courage in adversity, but by dint of accumulating disgusts upon disgusts, my poor stomach suffers and breaks. Never, said the witness, did I see in my life Don Bosco change expression, but that time alternately, as he spoke, he became pale and then flushed in the face. One of his biographers, Father Teresa Bosco, will write that since the Pope had asked him to apologize to the bishop, Don Bosco will have to accept and drink this bitter cup, but he will become a shadow of his former self, and so he heads towards death. He's heading towards death, such an uncertain situation. As I wrote in the title, because I have to close urgently as I wrote in the title, Don Bosco, the apostle of the sons of joy and of Mary. He had won, however, because despite death finding him sorrowful and weary, he remains joyful. And so I would like to recount the last episode, when he celebrated for the last time in Rome. He sees it's all clear. He returns to Turin, with acute phlebitis that prevents him from standing. It causes him great physical suffering. It's one of the last times Don Bosco comes down to the oratory. A boy runs up to him with a ball, shouting excitedly, "Don Bosco! Don Bosco!" Don Bosco turns, an old man, now ready to die. And he looks at him, "What is it, my son?" "Don Bosco, where are you going?" "Where are we going, my son?" "Ah," Don Bosco said, looking at him for a long time, as if in that child he wanted to see all the young people that he, with his sacrifice, everlasting, he had saved. "Off to paradise, my son. Let's go, to paradise." He turns down the road and goes to bed forever. And so, at the point of death, "Don Bosco, what do you want to say to your boys?" "Tell them I'm waiting."